My son's future mother-in-law did not know I was sitting 10 feet away when she said it. People like that are always grateful when someone offers them a fair price. I set the magazine down. I did not stand up. I did not correct her. 3 weeks later, I walked into that same building, opened a folder, and put 4 documents on the table in front of her husband. He looked at me and finally said my name. I said, "I know you didn't." Then I turned and walked toward my son. If you want to hear the whole story, stay with me and hit subscribe. My name is Delphine Winslow. I am 66 years old and I live in Charleston, South Carolina. In the house my husband James and I bought in 1981, I retired 4 years ago after 30 years as a public school principal. James died 10 years ago. I still sleep on my side of the bed. I have not moved his notebook from the top drawer of his desk. Some things you leave exactly where they are, because moving them feels like agreeing to something you are not ready to agree to. James was a carpenter. I was a teacher and then a principal. We were not wealthy in the way people mean when they use that word at dinner parties. We had a kitchen table with a coffee stain on the left corner. We had a shoebox under the bed with the mortgage papers. We knew what was in the checking account every Friday because we needed to know. But James had a way of seeing things other people looked past. Starting in the late 1980s and through most of the 1990s, he began buying old buildings in the historic district of Charleston. Not to flip them or develop them, just to hold them, to keep them from becoming something cheaper and faster and easier to ignore. Most people thought he was sentimental. He was. That was the whole point. We never talked about those buildings as something significant. James drove out on Saturdays to check on them and wrote everything down in a worn little notebook. I believed in those buildings because I believed in him. We raised our son Joss in a small house and never once sat him down and explained what we owned. It did not feel like the main thing. And then James got sick, and then James was gone, and someday ran out before he got to the conversations he had been planning. Joss is 39 now. He teaches history at a public school here in Charleston, which I think James would have loved. 2 years ago, Joss started seeing Amanda. I liked her from the first Sunday she came to the house. She worked at the local art museum, and she had a way of listening that made you feel like what you were saying actually mattered. I had not yet met her parents. Joss had mentioned them. Harrison Prescott, real estate developer, Lillian Prescott, involved in every social organization in the city that had a waiting list to join. Joss mentioned them the way you mention weather you are hoping will pass. So, that Tuesday morning, I was sitting in the waiting area of the Preservation Society office, holding a magazine, when I heard voices coming from the conference room down the hall. The door was not fully closed. I was not trying to listen. But the room was quiet and the voices carried, and one of them belonged to Harrison Prescott. I knew his voice because Joss had introduced us briefly at a community event 2 months earlier. A firm handshake, a quick scan of my clothes, a smile that moved on before it arrived. I had recognized the type immediately. Harrison was talking about the buildings on Queen Street. His tone was the tone of a man who had already made a decision and was now explaining it to someone who needed to catch up. He said the properties were being held by some kind of outdated preservation trust, probably set up by people who had no real understanding of what the land was worth now. He said whoever was sitting on those buildings was either sentimental or uninformed, possibly both. He said once his firm got the right people on the Preservation Society board, the review process for those properties would move considerably faster. Then Lillian said something I felt in my chest for a long time afterward. She said, "Well, we certainly do not need to worry about the mother. She is a retired school teacher. People like that are always grateful when someone offers them a fair price for something they cannot afford to maintain anyway." People like that. I set the magazine down on the chair beside me. I did not stand up. I just sat there for a moment, looking at the front door, thinking about a Tuesday morning in 1987 when James and I stood on the sidewalk in front of 14 Queen Street for the first time and he said, "Dot, I think this one matters." I had not known then what he meant exactly. I had trusted him. Anyway, what would you have done? Sitting in that chair, hearing your name reduced to a category, I left the envelope with the front desk and walked to my car. I sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. Not because I was upset, though I was. Because I was thinking, there is a difference between those two things. And it took me a long time in my life to learn it. The following week, I called Robert Hines, the estate attorney whose name I had found in the bottom drawer of James's desk, along with the property deeds and the living trust documents. I had gone through that drawer 6 months earlier. Finally, after 10 years of telling myself I would do it soon. What I found was not what I expected. James had set up a living trust in 2011 quietly, without making a production of it. 4 properties, all in my name, full authority over every decision. Sell, hold, pass to Joss at 45. Every door open, every choice mine. At the bottom of the envelope, in his handwriting on a small piece of notepaper, 4 words and my name. Dot. Don't sell 14 Queen. Robert Hines confirmed what I had suspected after the Preservation Society office. 3 purchase offers had come in for 14 Queen Street over the past 18 months, all through LLCs with no clear ownership on the surface. All below market value by roughly 30%. He had declined them all. I asked him to find out who was filing for board positions at the Preservation Society. He called me back the next morning. Harrison Prescott, pending review. Application submitted 6 weeks ago. Ah, there it was. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It was not rage. It was something quieter and in some ways harder to sit with. It was the feeling of being known only as your least interesting layer. Retired school teacher, fair price, cannot afford to maintain. People like that. I had spent 30 years in public schools, watching what happened to children who were seen only as their circumstances. You learn to fight it, or you learn to disappear. I had spent my whole career teaching children to fight it. I was not about to disappear now. I called Asoria that afternoon. I told her what I had heard. She was quiet for a long moment, which with Isoria means she is thinking rather than reacting, a quality I have always admired in her. Then she told me that Harrison's board application was scheduled for a formal review meeting in 3 weeks. The full board would vote. As a sitting board member of 15 years, I had a vote. I also had the right to present information relevant to any applicant's relationship with properties under the Society's jurisdiction. Isoria said this carefully, and then she said it again. I had 3 weeks. I did not spend those 3 weeks planning a dramatic confrontation. I want to be clear about that. I spent them doing what James would have done, which was making sure I understood exactly what I was dealing with before I said a single word. I met with Robert Hines in person and reviewed every offer letter, every LLC filing, every document. I called the city's Historic Preservation Office and requested records of variance applications connected to Queen Street properties over the past. There were 4, all filed by subsidiaries that trace back, eventually, to Harrison Prescott's development firm. And then something happened that I had not anticipated. Joss called on a Thursday evening and asked if he could come by. He arrived with Amanda, which was unusual for a weeknight. They sat at my kitchen table, the one with the coffee stain, and Amanda looked at Joss and then at me and said she needed to tell me something. She had found a file in her desk at the museum. She said, research she had done 8 months ago on a preservation dispute involving a building on Queen Street. She had written a formal objection letter to the society without knowing who owned the building. She had done it because it was right, she said, and because the proposed changes would have destroyed the original facade, and because she could not work at a museum dedicated to history and stay silent about something like that? She looked at the table when she said the next part. She said she had recently seen the deed records while doing follow-up research. She had seen the name Winslow on the trust. She was not sure what to do with that information, so she was telling me directly. I looked at her for a long moment. She did not look away. I thought about what it takes for a person to walk into their boyfriend's mother's kitchen and hand over something that complicated without knowing how it would be received. I have known a lot of people in my life. Not many of them would have done that. I told her I appreciated it. I told her I already knew about the letter. I told her it had mattered. Joss looked between us like a man watching a conversation happen in a language he was almost able to understand. He asked what was going on. I put my hand over his on the table and I said, I need to tell you some things about your father. We were there until nearly midnight. The board review meeting was held on a Thursday morning in the same conference room where I had overheard Harrison Prescott 3 weeks earlier. The irony of that was not lost on me. I arrived early. I sat in my regular seat at the board table. Isoria sat beside me. When Harrison and his attorney came in, Harrison's eyes found me across the table, and something moved behind them, a flicker of calculation, then a careful settling into neutral. He had done his homework in the 3 weeks since his application was filed. He knew I was on the board. He did not know what I knew. The review proceeded through the standard questions. Professional background, financial standing, familiarity with historic preservation law, proposed contributions to the Society's mission. Harrison answered everything smoothly. He was good at this. He had clearly been good at it for a long time. Do you ever watch someone perform competence and feel a specific kind of tired? When it came to the board's question period, I waited until the other members had finished. Then I opened the folder in front of me. I said I had some questions related to properties currently under the Society's jurisdiction. I asked Harrison whether his firm or any affiliated entity had filed variance applications on properties under active preservation review in the past 24 months. His attorney leaned toward him. Harrison said he would need to check his records. I said I had already checked them and placed the documents on the table. 4 applications, 4 properties, all within the Society's review zone, one of them 14 Queen Street, held by the J&D Winslow Preservation Trust. I said the name clearly, not for drama, because it was the relevant fact. Harrison looked at the documents. Then he looked at me. I watched him understand. It moved across his face the way weather moves. First the change in light and then the thing itself arriving. He said my name, not Mrs. Winslow, just Delphine, as though we were old friends who had simply misunderstood each other. I said I know. I said it the same way I used to say it to students who had made a choice without thinking it through. Not cruel, not satisfied. Just true. The board voted to defer Harrison's application pending a full review of the variance filings and their relationship to the Society's preservation mandate. It was not a dramatic vote. It was 5-1 with 1 abstention. The meeting ended. Harrison and his attorney gathered their papers. Lillian, who had been sitting in the observer chairs along the wall, stood up and did not look at me on her way to the door. I had not expected her to. My Soria walked with me to the parking lot afterward. She did not say much. She squeezed my arm before we reached our cars and said, James would have been very calm about all of this. I said, I know. She said that was not a criticism. I said, I know that too. The consequences settled without my involvement. Harrison's board application was formally declined 2 weeks later. The variance filings were referred to the city's Historic Review Committee, which opened an inquiry. Robert Hines received no further purchase offers on any of the 4 properties. Amanda told me, weeks later, that her parents had not spoken much about it at home. She said her mother had asked her once whether she had known, and Amanda had said yes. She said that conversation had been difficult but honest, and she thought it had needed to happen for a long time. Joss came by on a Saturday morning about a month after the board meeting. He had James's notebook with him. He had found it in the desk drawer when I had finally let him go through things, a process we had done together slowly over several weekends. He sat at the kitchen table and opened it to the first page. James's handwriting, careful and a little cramped, the way it always was when he was writing something he wanted to get right. Joss read for a long time without speaking. Then he asked me why his father had never shown him this. I got up and made more coffee. I stood at the counter with my back to him for a moment, not because I was avoiding the question, but because I wanted to answer it correctly. I said I thought James had been waiting for the right time and had run out of time before it came. I said that was the hardest thing about losing someone before you expected to. Not the grief, exactly. The conversations that did not get finished, Joss said. Do you think he knew what those buildings would be worth someday? I said, James never thought about them that way. He thought about what they were worth to keep. There is a difference between those two things, and your father understood it better than anyone I ever knew. Joss closed the notebook and held it in both hands for a moment. Then he asked if I would take him to see the buildings. All 4 of them, not just the ones he had driven past. I want to actually stand in front of them, he said. I want to know which one Dad found first. We went on a Saturday afternoon, just the 2 of us, walking through the old streets while the November light was low and flat and good. He asked questions and I answered them as best I could. Which building James had bought first and why? Which one had taken 3 full years to repair and what went wrong in the second year? Which one had a back staircase that James rebuilt completely by hand over one winter, working weekends, coming home with sawdust in his hair, and a particular look of quiet satisfaction that I had loved more than I ever found the words to say? We walked slowly. Neither of us was in a hurry. At some point, Joss put his arm around my shoulders, the way he used to when he was a teenager, and thought I needed steadying, which was usually when I was the one steadying him. And we just walked like that for a while without saying anything. I thought about James. I thought about people who assume they know the full weight of something from its surface. I thought about how long it takes to understand that silence is not the same as absence. Those were the lightest steps I had taken since James died. If you have ever had someone underestimate you and then had to decide what to do with that, I would like to hear about it in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, there is another one waiting for you right here.